Hey everybody, it's Mr. Cudell. We are about to start chapter 9. Now, a lot of you know what cellular respiration is. It's basically the burning of food in the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria of our bodies to make ATP, which is a potential energy storage molecule, where we store the energy that was once contained in the bonds, the covalent bonds between atoms and food, temporarily until we use it to power us through our day. Chapter 9 is I think it's wonderful. I think it's enlightening, but some kids say it's brutal. It's cellular respiration isn't the most exciting topic once you get down to all the chemistry and the nitty gritty. However, if you let it wash over you and you really try to read every word and try to understand what's going on, I think you might find it fascinating. And I believe it's something that you'll remember for the rest of your life. We are not going to go over much of this today. Just basically the first 2 pages. That's it. So let's get started with frogs.
Here's the thing about North American wood frogs. They're small. Very difficult to spot a frog. Very small, but they're everywhere, just out of view, hiding on the forest floor. He's camouflaged. His coloration is the same as the soil around him. See him here? He's cold. You can find them here in southern Ohio, all the way up to the Arctic Circle. But wherever they are, once it gets cold with the first sprinkle of ice, this frog does something I didn't know was possible. As soon as the frog just touches an ice crystal, this animal is going to freeze. Freeze? Solid freeze. That touch of ice immediately sets off signals inside the frog, says Professor John Costanzo, that pulls water away from the center of its body. So the frog's internal organs are now wrapped in a puddle of water that then turns to solid ice. I still can't get over it. It's really an amazing thing. There is no breathing, no kidney function. The heart stops. And there'll be no heartbeat for a long period of time. You, as in no heartbeat? Nothing. Flat heart. For an hour or two? It could be for days, perhaps even weeks. Really? It sounds like it's virtually dead. No. We know that the frog isn't dead, but it's probably about as close as you can get to being dead. Yes. So, from the outside, this little frog feels like a rock. Except that as it froze, the frog flooded itself with a kind of sugar. The frog's blood sugar is distributed through the circulatory system and works like an antifreeze. It's harder for the water to freeze, so cells stay just damp enough for the animal to hold itself together. Until the springtime. When the days grow a little longer, and the ground gets a little warmer. And then, well, a kind of miracle happens. After weeks or months of no heartbeat, none, suddenly there's a pulse. And that first heartbeat leads to another, and then another. And then within a day, in the case of this little frog, it took about 10 hours. The animal literally comes back to life. Spontaneous resumption of function. Why? We don't know. We don't know what triggers that event. And think how elegant a business this is. Because although the sun is warming up the outside of this little guy, somehow his insides, his heart, his brain, they thaw first. His insides warm up before his outsides. But somehow it all happens in perfect synchrony every spring. Yes, and it's going to undertake a very energetic activity. It's mating time. You mean hours after it falls, it's going to do it with a lady? It's going to perform.
Yeah, I don't know what else to say other than that. That's pretty awkward. Here we go. Here's the star of the show, the mitochondria. You've seen this before. You saw it in middle school. You're seeing it again today. I'd like you to whip out an entire fresh piece of paper. If you were in the classroom with me, I would give you a blank piece of paper, ask you to turn it horizontally and draw a massive mitochondria on it. So take a moment and do that, please. But anatomy and anatomical structures aren't enough. So we need to go over the physiology of this mitochondria and what does it actually do. So there's some structure there, of course, but remember, structure leads to function. There's nothing here that's coincidental, and I'm about to show you all the nuances of the mitochondria over this chapter. But there are some big picture processes that occur here, and I'd like you to label where you think they occur, and I'll go over this with you in a moment. There's glycolysis, this transition or link reaction, which I don't know if you've gone over that before, the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Make sure to focus on what goes in, what comes out. Make it look like a jelly bean. If you are struggling, you can go here in the textbook. This is a really good picture. If I was to hand you a handout, this would also be on the handout. Remember, we could go crazy learning every detail about this, but this is a 100 level college biology class. So reactants, products, big processes, where they occur, why they occur. That's what's important here. So focus on those things. Don't get lost in the overwhelming detail that this book has and that you could actually go into if you really wanted to even more. I think this is a good place to take a pause here for a second. And what I'd like you to do, you can flip over your piece of paper, or maybe you got it all correct, and you can teach the class. Let's go over these processes and where and why they happen. Remember, this is all about glucose. It is the base of the food pyramid, carbohydrate for us. It's the primary fuel source that we have. We certainly can break down proteins or fats also, but this is what the body goes to first because we're designed to break down carbs or sugars first. So let's imagine that we have glucose, and glucose, remember, goes into the digestive tract, down the esophagus, stomach. I guess it's broken up in the mouth a little bit enzymatically, also in the stomach a little bit, even more so in the small intestine, but then it gets absorbed into the bloodstream at the end of the small intestine and in the large intestine. The idea is that it goes in the bloodstream, goes into every cell of our body through diffusion or facilitated diffusion using a carrier protein, but we'll get to that, or maybe we've already gotten to that, I guess, chapter 6. The point is that it gets into cells and it's in the cytoplasm, and that's where glycolysis occurs. Remember that glucose has 6 carbons, so I've just written up here 6C. And what's going to happen in glycolysis is that this 6-carbon glucose is going to be broken down into 2 3-carbon. Does anyone remember what this is? Two pyruvates. Basically, we're just cutting that glucose in half, but we are going to get rid of a few things from it. And those are namely the hydrogen atoms, and we'll get to that in a moment, why those are important. But the point is that you get 2 pyruvates. This happens in the cytoplasm. The function of this is to prepare it for further breakdown in the mitochondria. We get some ATP that's created. Basically, it's 2 ATPs per glucose. There's 4 that are made, but 2 that are used, so net gain of 2. We'll get to that later. We also get these things called NADHs. That's something that's in another chapter. NADH, there's 2 of these that are created, and the goal of the NADH is to deliver this hydrogen atom to here, and we'll get there in a second, but I'll get to this in a second. Just understand that this NAD that you see here is one that we see here. We're going to make more NADs. We're going to reduce them to NADHs as we break down these pyruvates throughout this entire process. So as the pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, understand that it goes into the matrix or the middle of the mitochondria. We have this inner membrane space, but that's intermembrane. It's in between the two membranes. There's an outer and inner membrane here. I'm going to write down the word link. There's a link or transition reaction which further breaks down the pyruvates and adds this kind of carrier molecule called acetyl to it. And then we get something at the end of the link reaction called acetyl-CoA. We'll get into that detail later. I'm going to draw a circle here, and I'm going to write CAC, the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, named after Hans Krebs, the German scientist who figured all this out. The whole idea of the link in the citric acid cycle is to take this glucose molecule, break it down into nothing. All the carbon and oxygen atoms here are linked together, and they are expelled as a byproduct called CO2, which then diffuses into the bloodstream, eventually makes it up to the lungs, diffuses into the tracheal tubes through the bronchioli, through the alveoli and the bronchioles, up the bronchi and the bronchus to your windpipe, and then you exhale it into the atmosphere. But the point is, that's where all the CO2 that you exhale comes from. It's the breakdown of your food. The only thing that's left here are these little white plastic things called the hydrogen atoms. And the goal is for these NADs and FADs, I'm going to write an H on the end of them because they have grabbed hydrogen atoms from this molecule. The goal is for them to deliver the hydrogen atoms to the inner membrane space. And when they do that, we'll get to it in a few moments, but understand that, well, I'll show you right here. Understand that a hydrogen atom is made up of two things, an electron and a proton, which we will abbreviate as H+. I'll get to the chemistry behind it in a second, but I'm going to draw an arrow here, and the idea is that the electrons go through something called the electron transport chain. And so I'm just drawing a squiggly line there with an E negative, and I'm just trying to show that the electrons are going to kind of go through all these proteins that exist here in the intermembrane, in the inner membrane. The protons, or the other portion of the hydrogen atom, go in here, in the inner membrane space. And the idea is that they don't like to be near one another. They all have the same charge, they're high concentration, they want to diffuse away. And so a protein channel opens up, they flow through here. So let me draw an H+ on the other side of this. They flow back into the middle or the matrix of the mitochondria. But here's the key point of all of this, is when they do that, that's a lot of energy. Think of like water going through a dam. We can harness that energy to spin a turbine, to make electricity and power our homes. And so the idea is that all the oxygen that you breathe in is that when those guys go through here, it's enough energy to phosphorylate an adenosine diphosphate to make it a triphosphate. So that energy then is put here between the bond of the second and third phosphate group, and then we get ATP as a result of it. So the whole goal was to create this energy storage molecule called ATP. Well, you have to realize that the electron has now come through all these proteins. It's going to go back to the middle here. The proton is going to flow through here, go back to the middle, and they're going to come back together, and they're going to make a hydrogen atom. And when they do so, it's important to get rid of these things. You can't allow all these H+ to accumulate in here, or else there will be no more diffusion or driving force of them to go in there. So we got to get rid of these. When they come back together as hydrogen atoms, we've got to get rid of that. And the way that we do that is by breathing. You know how you increase your breath as you run around the track? The idea is that you're burning more food to make more ATP, to contract your muscles, to power your running muscles. And so the idea is that we're inhaling a ton of oxygen. It's going to go in here, and it's just going to grab that hydrogen atom. So there's the hydrogen atom. If you get two of those and you put them together with a half of an oxygen molecule, you'll create a byproduct of cellular respiration called water. What I'm trying to just show down here is kind of give you a little bit more idea with the initial stick figure that I have of glucose, that the NADs are going to grab those hydrogens, they're going to deliver them to the electron transport chain, and then eventually the hydrogen atoms are going to be bound to oxygen atoms from an oxygen molecule to create water. And then this is going to be the energy that we need to make ATP. The carbons and the oxygens from this molecule are then put together as CO2, and then we exhale it. So I want you to press pause, and I want you to go over this. Spend 5 minutes going over this, and maybe 10. Really understand where things happen. If you need to watch it again, that's fine. Really take a moment and take a look at this, because everything else is going to be detail that's based off of this. Do that now, please. So we're going to touch on 9.1 in the book. It has to do with redox reactions. We'll get to that in a second, but I just want you to understand that this is what all life is all about. Life is chemistry. So, and chemistry is physics. So really the physicists say that we are the most important, because physics is how all the kind of atoms stick together. And then, of course, if you look at biology or life at the most elemental level, it's all chemistry. So really biologists are kind of third wheel here. Cellular respiration is just like that. It's tons of these biochemical reactions. Here it is. This is cellular respiration. Now, if you were in other high schools or college classes, we may have you memorize all these steps, all the enzymes that facilitate these molecular intermediates that you see kind of going down this flow chart. But I don't think that makes any sense. I think what's important, because you can always look it up in a textbook, I think what's important for kids is that they understand the big picture and then some small details within that big picture. But you don't need to memorize a bunch of names or anything in the middle of this, because look it up. This is what, about the level that's a little bit higher than what your textbook says. What I like is a picture that I found years ago, and cellular respiration really hasn't changed as far as teaching it at a 100 level course over the last 10, 15 years. And so I'm going to give you this picture, and this is the level at which I want you to understand it. You can see here a lot of kind of cartoons and balls on and like little circles and stuff. And I'll tell you exactly what you need to know here. I do want you to read everything in the chapter. It's just when it comes to memorizing terms and enzymes and stuff like that, I will let you know what you need to know. But I do want you to read what I ask you to read in the chapter for sure. Again, we're just going to go over the first section right now, 9.1, and there is a lot here. So I would say do not delay. The Cliff's Notes on this is huge, as well as the chapter's just big. It's going to take maybe 3 or 4 times of us getting together to get through this. I'll try to make it interesting. I'll try to make it relevant to you, but do not delay. That's my point with showing you this slide. So here's a picture, 9.1. It's on page 163 in the 10th edition. I want you to press pause, and I want you to teach your neighbor what's going on in this picture, please. Well, this is just a kind of a summary picture of what we've already went over with that giraffe eating that acacia tree. The idea is that energy flows into biological systems as light energy. It's then taken up by chloroplasts, which exists in many organisms, including plant cells. And then if you go around the circle, you'll see that the products of that, which are glucose and oxygen, are then utilized by mitochondria to make ATP. We then have byproducts there as we go up kind of the left side of this figure. And those byproducts are water and carbon dioxide. And you see how it's a cycle. Isn't it wonderful? It's incredibly elegant how everything kind of flows. The products of one reaction are the reactants of the other. And you see that again and again. But as far as energy goes, you need a constant supply in, because if you look at the bottom of this, you can see that energy is lost as heat over time. I think it's elegant and it's wonderful and it's complicated, and through evolution this has been created, and I think it's the bomb. Sorry, just do. Photosynthesis is pretty important. Cellular respiration, using those products of photosynthesis is pretty important. Okay, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. So this is not a chemistry class. So just learn redox reactions at the level at which I'm about to teach you. So this says catabolic pathways. Remember, catabolism is breaking something down. They yield energy by oxidizing or taking electrons from organic fuels. Oxidizing. So let's think about that word oxidizing. What do you think of when you think of oxidizing? You think of probably oxygen. I want you to write this down right now. Oxidation means taking electrons from. And specifically, we're taking electrons from, let me grab it, from this guy. Where do the electrons reside? Well, they reside in these covalent bonds that exist between these atoms here. There's a lot of covalent bonds here. These are electrons that are being shared here. That's what we went through chapter 2, chemistry. This is an exergonic reaction. When that glucose molecule gets broken apart, if you read this from left to right, you see it's an exergonic reaction. Lots of kilojoules per mole, 686 kilojoules per mole of energy is liberated when this happens. I want you to write this down, and I'm going to write it down to oil rig. But first, let's go over here. Let's imagine that we have a hydrogen atom. Because remember, what I told you, and this molecule, what's important are the hydrogen atoms. That's where the energy really is that we're going to then use. So that's chemical potential energy that we're going to turn into kind of kinetic energy as these protons move through these little channels in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And that energy is harvested to add a phosphate group to ADP to make ATP. But the point is that we're just looking at the hydrogen atoms. The carbon and the oxygen atoms are here in your food, but then you're going to exhale that later on once they get broken up in the citric acid cycle. Remember that a hydrogen atom, if you look up at the top left corner of the periodic table, it has one proton, and then in the outside it has one electron. That's it. There's no neutrons because the atomic mass is 1. So atomic mass is 1, and that's just right here. That's encompassed by the one proton that I see. So remember, a hydrogen atom, and here it is made up of two things, an electron and a proton. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I just want you to formalize this. I want you to draw this right now. So when we say oil rig, it's just kind of a little mnemonic device that we use to try to remember oxidation is loss of hydrogen atoms or electrons, because remember that electrons are embedded within hydrogen atoms. And reduction is gain, which means if something is going to gain hydrogen atoms or electrons, then it's being reduced. So we can oxidize organic fuel molecules during cellular respiration. What that means is oxidation is lost. So this glucose molecule will be oxidized because I'm going to tear this off. This hydrogen atom will be lost, or the electrons in the hydrogen atom is now lost. This thing was oxidized. But if this is oxidized, that hydrogen atom has to go somewhere. Something is going to be reduced here. And what did I say over there on the other board that's going to be reduced? Well, we've got these two players here, and they're basically just electron carriers, the hydrogen atom carriers, or electron carriers. We'll get to that distinction in the next part of the chapter. But the point is that this thing comes in and it tears off the hydrogen, and I showed you that at the bottom of that screen, that board, it tears the hydrogen off the glucose molecule. It's then going to deliver it to the inner membrane of the mitochondria to do cellular respiration. But the point is that here it is. Here it was. Well, actually, it's NAD+. It has a charge. And we'll get to the detail in a second, but the next time I talk to you. But the point is it's just going to grab electrons or hydrogen atoms from this. So this thing is oxidized. This thing is reduced. During cellular respiration, the fuel, such as glucose, is oxidized, and they say oxygen is reduced. And the reason why they say that is because eventually, I showed you this on the other board, eventually, here's our oxygen molecule. Eventually, this is going to be grabbed enzymatically, and it's going to be put next to one of these oxygen atoms, and we're going to get water. But the point is that oxygen is reduced at the end of this. It's going to gain electrons or maybe hydrogen atoms at the end. So go ahead, press pause, go over oil rig, redox reactions, what you know about the chemistry of the hydrogen atom, please. I'm going to show you a little movie and then we'll be done.
But what's up with those words? You know what reduction is? Making less of something. And then oxidation maybe has something to do with oxygen. Well, sometimes, not always. These are actually super terrible choices for what is actually happening in redox reactions, but we are stuck with them. Reduction is when a substance gains electrons. Yes, it gains, which is the opposite of what the word reduce means. Fantastic. And yes, sometimes I want to punish the people who named these things so inaccurately, but they didn't know any better and they're all dead, so we can't do anything about it. Protochemists would make pure metals by heating or smelting their ores. And they noticed during the smelting that these substances would become lighter. So I guess it's not crazy that they decided to say that these substances were being reduced. Our old French friend Antoine Lavoisier figured out that this was because oxygen gas was actually leaving the compound, making it lighter. What he didn't know was the actual chemistry involved. Oxygen is, unsurprisingly, the quintessential oxidizer. It pulls electrons off of one molecule to make itself more stable. But if you heat it up enough, it gets all energetic. Today, we understand that oxidation and reduction are all about electron transfer. So you might think that we renamed them. And some chemists have tried producing terms like electronation and de-electronation. But once a set of terms is decided upon and used for a while, it's pretty difficult to uncreate it. So we're stuck. To keep these seemingly nonsensical names straight, I rely on the phrase oil rig. Oxidation is loss of electrons, reduction is gain of electrons. We just gotta know this stuff, because it's everywhere. When your cells convert sugar into energy so you can move and breathe and think, that's redox. When plants photosynthesize sunlight into food, that's redox. The battery powering your laptop? Redox. Fire? Also redox. Since electron swapping is the name of the game here, when you study redox reactions, it's important, critical, absolutely essential to keep track of the electrons. Think of them as dollars or pesos or pounds or euros. In any transaction, one person is going to gain them and the other is going to lose them.
Okay, so we're going to stop there. If you need more on redox reactions, Mr. Anderson has a nice video, or you can ask me for help. Thanks.